long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is Constant Reader Scott Daly.
And I'm Constant Reader Matt Freeman.
Whoa. You think just because you spent like an entire year reading, analyzing, and discussing Stephen King in great detail, you could just call yourself a constant reader?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. This week on the show, we're taking one final look at the final book in the Dark Tower series. This is our overview episode for The Dark Tower. We're going to do a few things on this episode. We're going to kind of look back at the quotes at the beginning of the book and see what we think about those now that we've finished the series. We're just going to take a look at that ending again and talk about that some more. Maybe see, now that you've gotten to sit with it for a little while, Matt, if your opinions on any of the stuff have changed a bit. And we're going to talk about the book overall, the structure of the book, how we feel about what this book as a whole was. I think these are good episodes because sometimes we get so wrapped up in the trees that we gotta take one look at that forest, you know?
I think that's absolutely true, especially considering that heading into this conversation, I had to look at the Wikipedia article on the book, The Dark Tower, just to be like, what happened in this book?
Yeah, I mean, we've been on this book since Thanksgiving of last year.
Yeah.
That's how long we've been talking about book 7. So it's a long book. We spent many weeks on it, and I think it's good to just kind of take a look back at it and see what we want to see. So we're going to do that. And then we've got all your mailbag questions to go through. We got a ton of questions from you guys, so we're going to take the time and go through as many of those as we can. I will say, if you've looked at our schedule, next week we are not moving right on to the Wind Through the Keyhole. Next week we're going to do a whole big entire series overview episode. I programmed this into the schedule way back when we started, just thinking like certainly by the time we finish this we're going to want to talk about the series as a whole, so I said let's just do an episode for that. So we're going to answer some of your discussion questions, or your mailbag questions rather, that are more whole series focused next week. So if you send in a question already and it doesn't get read this week's episode, it's because I've moved it to next week's. It also means if you haven't sent in a question already, you get an extra week to send in your discussion question. So giving you a little bit more time. So do that. And we're going to be having a guest on next week's episode. So it's going to be a fun couple of weeks before we dive into the Wind Through the Keyhole and wrap up season 1.
Yeah. All right,
Matt, let's talk about the Dark Tower. So I guess first, Matt, what'd you think about the Dark Tower, book 7? What'd you think?
I loved it. It's difficult to talk about something this huge.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I sort of suspect that people listening to us might be just as unsure as I am about what actually happened in this book, because I've been studying this book with more intensity than I think the average person reads a book, which is totally fine. I'm a big fan of just reading most of the time when I'm not doing a podcast. But I just wanted to like maybe start out by just reminding everyone and us, like, this book starts out with Jake and Father Callahan going into the Dixie Pig, fighting the vampires and low men, Father Callahan dying, and then them eventually making their way through to Susanna, right? And then in parallel, I believe Eddie and Roland are recruiting John Cullum in Maine. Yeah.
So they've already had their interaction with Stephen King, and now they're just trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next? Yeah.
And then they go from there to eventually, they basically go through like a rift, and then they end up meeting up with the other characters. But that's like so long ago. Like it's really, I mean, it is funny because like my memory of the recent part of the story, with Susanna being in the cold and making hides and everything, it's so much clearer. I feel like we read the Dixie Pig battle, a year ago rather than, I guess it was like 3 months ago. So that's not trivial.
Yeah, and I think part of this feeling, and we've had this feeling for every single book we've talked about, where we spent so much, especially the long ones like Wizard and Glass, Wolves of the Calla, we had this feeling. But I do think those books, from a structural perspective, have a much clearer like overarching structure. They feel much more like a contained novel than this book does. And that's kind of the thing I wanted to talk to you about this book about, because I think this book, and I think maybe we could say in conclusion novels in general, there is this feeling where you gotta throw a lot of shit in there. You gotta throw, like, just because you're trying to wrap up everything you've been doing across these 7 books. And so King is kind of just throwing everything at the wall in this last book. And some people don't like the nature of the final 3 books because of this, especially this last book. The people that don't like this book tend to not like it because there's just so much happening. And I don't think, like, if you take this book, if you carve it out from the series and just look at it as a independent separate novel, I think this one holds up the least structurally, because it's not really telling one complete story from beginning to end here. This is very clearly the final arc of a bigger story happening here. So there's all this stuff happening. There's not really a sense of beginning and end to this specific novel.
Mm-hmm. You know, back in like the 90s when computer generated graphics were sort of new, and there would be just like a whole like movie that would just be like some animation studio flexing on what they could do with computers. And it would just be a whole bunch of disconnected vignettes of like cool shit.
Uh-huh.
The Dark Tower sometimes is like that, but in story form, where my point isn't, oh, it's all disconnected nonsense. My point is it's flexing. My point is he's showing off, or maybe a more fair and accurate word would be exploring, like, how much fun you can have if you sort of relax the normal restrictions on what a book is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm like in the middle of reading On Writing, which I think I read when I was in high school, actually, but I've completely forgotten. And one thing that he says in that book is, like, he doesn't plot things out in advance.
No.
He just lets the characters lead, basically.
Yep.
And I think this is what happens when you let your characters lead in a story that involves magic doors and Stephen King as a character who could potentially change the story, and etc. And there's time travel. And so, like, I think this is what makes it work. Like, this is why I love it fundamentally, is he's totally faithful and consistent when it comes to the core, like, promise of, are the characters going to be consistent? Are the characters going to feel authentic and visceral and real? And you're going to love them and root for them and feel for them.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is true. And then there is kind of a core honesty to the theme of the story of, we have these characters who are all, essentially you could call them addicts or people who are struggling with something, and they're all on this journey together.
Yeah.
He is faithful to the things that matter. And then beyond that, I think that's, it's actually kind of liberating to me to know that, like, you can, as long as you're faithful to those things, like what is the point of the story and who are these characters? As long as you're faithful to those, you can get so buck wild with your plot, and it's fine. Not only is it fine, but you're just loving it. You're having a great time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
no, I think you're totally right. And I think playing is a great way of describing it, because if you look at this book, I mean, we have the stuff in the Dixie Pig at the beginning. Then we have, like, I just remember, like, he just throws in these Children of Roderick, and you're just like, wait, what? And then suddenly there's this giant battle of Algol Ciento, which I think could have been its own novel in and of itself. Like, everything around Algol Ciento and their shutting down of what the Breakers are going could have been its own separate story. And that thing wraps up, and then we rush off to do this thing, this Saving Stephen King. And then once that's done, we kind of move into a new book where it's the Roland and Susanna show, which are the things that are the freshest in our mind, because it's what we've been talking about these last few weeks. That almost feels like it's its own independent little story. And there's nothing bad about doing it this way, as you said. It's just not a novel in the way, like, you would normally think about a novel. And it's really unusual. And I'm so glad that you still enjoyed it, because I do think there are moments where I'm like, would this have been better structured if he had like sat down and planned out what this final book was going to be beforehand. And the answer is maybe, but this is what we got. And I love it for it, because it's the good moments, the moments that are earned and wonderful and impactful and powerful work so well, regardless of any weird kind of structural meandering that happens throughout this novel.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was gonna say in response to that, despite the fact that it's structurally kind of vague, I always felt like I knew where we were going and what was important. But then interestingly, I thought to myself, before I opened my mouth to say that, I was like, well, actually, there was that point in time after Jake died where Roland is just kind of like listlessly, he meets up with the woman who he hooks up with. I forgot her name. Sorry.
Miss Tassenbaum.
But what's interesting about that is like the point of that is that Roland also feels listless, right? So like we don't know where the story is heading.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, well, we won. We saved the breakers. We saved the beam. We saved Stephen King. Jake's dead. What now? And so I guess what I was going to say to go in a circle is like, even when it does begin to feel like you're losing track of what you're supposed to be paying attention to, like that is actually the point of what the story is doing. So I think there's just something, like, King is such a good writer. He's just aware of kind of where your head is at. And he's always kind of playing you in one way or another. And I don't know if all of his books are like that. Again, I haven't read many of them, but I feel like that's a special thing about The Dark Tower, is the degree to which he is sort of always a step ahead of you, in that metafictional way, where he's going to yell at me for using that word in a minute. But yeah, I don't know. That's what makes this book in particular a unique experience, I think, is, yeah, I do feel like he's sort of manipulating you more than maybe even in the other books, actually.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong there. I mean, I think the fact that Roland is Stephen and Stephen is Roland really matters when talking about that, because I think you're absolutely right that he channels. I feel like, and again, this is conjecture. I try to limit how much our analysis of this book is impacted by King himself. I try to just focus on the novel itself, and it feels in that moment where Jake has died, they've saved Stephen King, the battle has been won. It feels like Stephen King himself is like, okay, what the fuck do I do now? Like, I've got to end this book. How do I get Roland from here to the tower? What has to happen next? And he is a good enough writer to understand that part of this whole weird commentary on storytelling he's doing is channeling that thing that he's feeling as a writer of the book into the character of the story, and thusly channeling it into us, the reader of the story. So it's like he talks about writing as a communion between reader and author, right? And so it's just this wonderful moment where we're both kind of feeling the same thing. Him writing it back in 2003, us reading it here in 2021, and we're both feeling the same feeling of what now, because that's what Roland is feeling. And it's just remarkable. And I think that's what this book is doing again and again and again, is like, I mean, especially at the end when we're like, we got to see what's at the top of the tower. We're as anxious for it as Roland is. And he knows that. Of course he knows that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the degree to which he talks directly to us and says, it gets more and more as we get along in the book, right? Like, maybe he did it a little bit in the other books, but this is within this book we have, and here comes the part that you will not want to read and I will not want to write, and then that escalates into, are you sure you want to keep reading? Because, you really got the gist of it already, and nothing happy is going to be beyond this point. It's the monster at the end of this book effect.
Yeah, as one of our listeners pointed out to us. I think that was Sammy who said, this book is just the monster at the end of this book. And I think that's so important, and to have a grasp on that. We're going to talk about his author's note here in a bit, and it just makes me understand that he's fully aware of the degree of difficulty with which he's playing with these things, and just the fact that he pulled it off, in my opinion, or even got close to pulling it off, I think is really remarkable.
Yeah, me too.
It's kind of like, God, we got the Church of the God Bomb. We got like, it's hard to believe that the meeting with Moses Carver and the rest of the Tet back in New York is in the same book as the end of the book. Like, this is all stuff that happened in this one book. It's crazy.
It's hard to believe that Ted Brautigan's whole backstory, where the book just kind of takes a break and we get a little short story from Ted Brautigan. That's in this book.
Yep, that is in this book. Yeah. There's so much going on here, and I know, like, he always envisioned it as this 6 or 7 book thing, even from the beginning. It does feel like, actually, this is a good question. It's kind of moving to what we're going to talk about next week, but do you feel like, we kind of talked about at the beginning that maybe book 6 could have been squeezed into book 5 or divided between book 5 and book 7, that it feels like this thing that's separate from all of them. I've in my opinion, I've like fully changed my mind about this, and I'm curious what you think now that you finished the series.
That was Song of Susanna, right?
Yes.
It's without thinking too hard about it or having the chance to kind of look over the structure, it feels all right for me. Like, if you're gonna have to break this series into books, then that seems okay to me.
I just feel like Song of Susanna, out of any of these later 3 books, feels like the most complete beginning to end story. Like, he just had this very clear vision of what exactly that book was going to be, and perhaps that's why it's shorter, because he's like, I have this very clear thing I want to do. It could go in some in book 5, some in book 7. I just want to do it in this one book, and I just want to do all this part, and it leaves the book on a cliffhanger, but importantly, not for Mia, which is really what the book is about. It's Mia's book, and I don't know. It just, I fell in love with that book this time through, and I don't want to change anything with that. I wonder if I don't even know if I want to say this, because I don't know if I believe it, but I wonder if book 7 would have been served better carving it into multiple novels instead of this one long one. And I don't know if I agree with what I just said there. I don't know.
So the way I think about this sort of thing, and this is not a silver bullet that just like solves the problem, because I don't think it can necessarily be solved. But the way I think about it is to break things into acts and to ask whether an individual book has, a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure or whatever. I think The Gunslinger has a standard act structure, whatever number, it doesn't really matter. It's a simple let's call it 3-act for simplicity. It's a 3-act book.
We can call it a 5-act book because it literally has 5 chapters, so we can simplify everything. I don't think it actually follows the Shakespearean 5-act structure.
No,
but we can call it that.
I don't. It may. That's an interesting question, but anyway, we can
let's table that and talk about it next week.
Let's table it. The drawing of the 3 follows a pretty solid act structure in terms of setting up the situation, exploring the situation, giving us a good middle part of the story to play in, and then resolving, right? And by the end of that story, you have drawn the 3 and everything is resolved, right? But the more books you go on, this is a problem with all series, is what I'm getting to, is that eventually you're like, okay, these are the same characters. We've introduced them. We've introduced the stakes and the conflict of the larger plot of the series. You can't just have another book that has a 5-act Shakespearean structure, because like you can't like reintroduce the characters every time. We already know these characters. It stops working. And so what you end up with is you kind of segue into this thing where the whole series has an act structure, where like Gunslinger and Drawing of the 3 are act 1, and then act 2 is, I don't know, the next book or 2, and then but then like you end up with like act like the middle act of the book is like the last 3 books, and then the ending act is like the last 100 pages of the Dark Tower. Like you see the problem. It's not a problem. It's just, this is what happens when you tell an enormous story.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when you tell any kind of series story where you're trying to tell this one story across multiple novels, you run into this problem. I think you're right. So yeah, I mean, I don't at the end of the day, I don't think it matters the way these books are carved up, really. I do agree with you that The Gunslinger is a very concise, complete novel. Drawing of the Three, by the nature of what it is, when you define this, okay, you're going to draw three people now, it feels like you're telling a complete story. The Wastelands is an interesting one because I don't think it is at all. I mean, I think this is just the next leg of the story. I really need to think about the overarching events in that book to see if it really comes together in something from beginning to end there. I think Wizard and Glass is, by the nature of it's designed to be this story, right? It's like our character's telling a story that has a clear beginning, middle, and end. So it's almost its own book because it's basically redoing the whole story, right? By introducing new characters, and he's kind of cheating in that way. Yeah. Wolves is interesting because it has a clear end point structurally, because we know we're defined from the very beginning that the wolves are coming and this is going to be what the end of the story is. But other than that, everything else is kind of loose. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, is it's sort of Seven Samurai or whatever. But we and then like in parallel to that, we're doing a lot of interesting stuff with like Mia and the Katet breaking apart and all of that. But you're right that like, and then it also has Father Callahan's story. So like I think this is really interesting to think about. And again, we might be stealing conversation topics from next week, but I think it's interesting to consider that, like, I think he's aware of the fact that he can't move the ball too far forward on like the individual plot lines of Roland, Eddie, Jake, and Susanna. And so he fills the book with, okay, well, what's going on with this town? What's going on with Father Callahan? The mystery of the wolves and all that stuff. And it turns out great. Like, I love that book. It's just the point is, you begin to kind of have to pump the brakes on your main characters, and I don't know. I wouldn't call it a problem. It's just there's a definite reason why the latter two books, the final two books of the Dark Tower, just become this like luge ride straight downhill of madness, because he knows he has to get to the destination, and he's now playing with all of the stuff that he set up in the first several books, and like this is the Act 4. Act 5 of his 5-act structure, which the first 3 acts were, 3,000 pages or something like that.
No, I think you're onto something there. Totally agree. I want to spend some more time thinking about this and diving into it. So maybe we'll circle back around to this next week. But I really want to study the overall structure of the series and see if we can drop it into that Shakespearean 5-act structure.
One last comment on the act thing. I think my favorite definition of what an act is that an irrevocable decision has been made at the end of an act. And that might just be a fun way to kind of cut through the story and figure out what are some sensible places to put act breaks.
Yeah. So we'll circle back around to that next week. We'll kind of, for those of you that maybe don't know what the Shakespearean act structure is, we'll kind of give y'all a crash course in that as we break it down next week. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
I'm writing it down. All right, cool. But overall, the structure of this book is kind of, I don't think we could stick it in that. I think it's kind of loosey-goosey in that regard.
I think you're right.
But I don't think it matters, because I think that the point of this book is not to tell its own individual story. The point of this book is to get to the end, to stick the landing, to conclude the arcs for each and every one of our characters. And I think that is something it does very well. If you kind of break the book down, you can say the Father Callahan conclusion, the Eddie conclusion, the Jake conclusion, the Susanna conclusion, the Oi conclusion, and then the Roland conclusion. That's like the easiest way to kind of structurally break down this book. And I think it falls very neatly into those different, we'll call them acts, different acts.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep.
All right. I want to talk about Darkle and Tinct a little bit.
Okay.
Because we had one of our listeners, Full Fathom 5, that pointed out that these words, of course, were not originated by King, but actually came from another piece of literature. These words come from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Here's the quote that Full Fathom 5 was nice enough to point out for us. "It darkles, tinct, tint, all this fundamental world. Yon marsh pond by Rudmark verge is visited by the tide. Avel Marea, we are circumveloped by obscuritades, men and bells friren." So James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is a book I've never read because it's one of the hardest books to read ever, because that sentence I just read is a pretty perfect example of, it's kind of just it's designed nonsense, right? It's onomatopoeic. Like I think literally fundamental is just supposed to mean fundamental, but he writes in onomatopoeia. He writes in it's clever wordplay. It's like one of those books that I think you could spend the rest of your life studying, and you would find something new that he's doing in every single sentence. But it's really hard to just sit down and open up and read.
Yes. I mean, I'd like to read it once it's translated into English.
No, that's half the fun.
Sure.
Is trying to figure out what he's going for here. And
Sure.
I think as Full Fathom 5 points out, like, I think Joyce almost doesn't want you to break it down and study it. He wants the emotion, like poetry. He wants you to just feel what the words make you feel.
Yeah, let it wash over you. And I mean, what's fun is, once again, I mean, we didn't notice it this time, but Full Fathom 5 has pointed out to us that King is doing the thing where he's referencing literature, but not in a way where he's like lording it over you, just kind of being like, hey, this might be something you want to follow up on. Yeah. And of course, the thing we have to say most importantly here about the using a reference to the novel Finnegan's Wake is particularly charged for this series, because Finnegan's Wake is itself a cyclical narrative, right? The opening line of that book is a fragment of a sentence that the finishing line of the book starts. So it is by design a circle. You read the last line of that book, and the second half of that sentence will be the first line of the book. It is a cyclical book. And so by referencing in the moment as Roland is climbing the tower to kind of call back to these lines of darkling and tinct, it is kind of King cleverly winking at you a little bit that here's how my book's going to end. Yeah. I mean, I assume that was a edit in the revised edition.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, which makes sense. I mean, still pretty awesome. So I was surprised actually to learn, especially considering how many made up seeming words are in this sentence, that darkle and tinct are actually words. Tinct literally just means tint, which is kind of funny that Joyce put tinct, tent. And then darkles, in my brain, I stored it as meaning the opposite of sparkles, which is probably an okay. It kind of just means like darkens. It's an evocative. That's what you were saying about Joyce being more interested in sort of painting an image, but it's something that darkens and flickers with darkness. That's what comes to mind when you say darkles and tincts.
For sure. Yeah, and I mean, so kind of. To go back to how these words are used in this story, that's an interesting way to describe Roland, right? I mean, when we first see the words used, once again, this is to describe the ageless stranger, this person that we never specifically meet, but it is possible it is several people. But we do know that at the end of this book, the ageless stranger is the same words used to describe the ageless stranger are used to describe first the Crimson King. It's from Patrick, who is explaining why it is difficult for him to draw him because he darkles and tinks. And then Roland himself, you darkle, you tinct, and frankly, you go on. So, I mean, these are interesting words considering the black and the white, or if we want to say the white and the red and get more technical about it, are such powerful color-based imagery in these stories, right? The white being the side of good that Roland is a soldier for, to understand, to describe him as tinting, as darkening is interesting.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think that there's a case to be made that this is a character who has been inconsistently good. You know, I maybe we're jumping ahead here, but I think it's very interesting. You know, one of the things you walk away from this book from is you're just definitely going to spend the next week thinking like, so what were the previous cycles like? So what's the next cycle going to be like? So how did this all start out? So who was Roland on the first cycle? You know, was he a monster to rival Jack Mort on the first cycle? You know, what of his memories are new? You know, what things were unchanged and what things were always the same? And I think there's, you know, this is the guy who, you know, shot Allie in the face in the first book and then let the kid fall, right? And that was on this cycle where he eventually kind of turned into a good person eventually. So I think that Roland is a character who's been, you know, tainted, if you will, with you know, he struggles very much with even knowing what the right thing is, much less doing it. So yeah, I think he darkles for sure.
And I mean, if we look at this James Joyce section here, I mean, we can talk about what we think it means, and it seems to me to be saying something to the effect of like, it darkles, tinct, tint, all this fundamental world. Like, the world grows darker. The world grows darker. Jan Marshpod Verge is visited by the tide. The tide comes in. Like, the change happens, and in this context, I think it's like negative. The world is growing a little bit darker. But at the same time, Roland, it is in this moment where he's made the mistake once again, where the tower is maybe a little exasperated with him and be like, you darkle, you tinct, like you grow dark, you keep making this mistake. So there is still hope there, I think, but I do the context here being pretty negative is very interesting to me.
Yeah. It is interesting. You know, you mentioned that the Crimson King was also referred to as being someone who darkles and tinks. I'm wondering if that's just like, is it because he's trapped in the cycle too in his own way? You know, maybe he's aware that the cycle exists and that's why he wants to destroy the Dark Tower.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, we know that the Man in Black, his servant, is at least on some level aware of it. It seems so. It would make sense that the Crimson King is aware of it as well. One of the things I think, if you listen to a few episodes ago, I started talking about the Crimson King, and then I couldn't remember whether we knew something about him or not yet, so I just like stopped myself. But one of the things we're supposed to understand about the Crimson King is that he and Roland might share a common ancestor. They might both be of the line of Eld at some point in their past. So like the fact that we make comparisons between the Crimson King and Roland himself, I think are it's a very interesting charged imagery, you know, that like they share this common origin point. They both darkle and tinct here at the end. And they're both seemingly cursed to keep repeating this process.
One you know, crazy theory that I never actually said out loud was like, what if they're the same person?
I mean, we could. I don't want to think this because I love Roland so much, but what if the Crimson King is a version of Roland that got to the tower as a monster? What if the reason why, like we talked about how this is Roland's tower, and we know this because the Crimson King goes in there and sees the birth of Roland, just like Roland did, like sees the shroud that he was swaddled in. What if that's because that was his shroud too? I don't know if the timeline of all this stuff actually bears that out, but with the cyclical nature of this whole thing, anything's possible with the tower. Anything's possible through Ka. So I don't think that's an impossibility.
Right. Or I mean, I don't think this quite works because they're both from Midworld, but you could imagine that they're from different worlds. Like they're literally the same person from different worlds.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like we this kind of moves us into our next conversation about the ending itself. But like, you could the worlds are infinite, right?
Yeah.
The number of worlds is infinite. So literally, every cycle does not have to be Roland going back in time, but Roland just moving to a different world.
Yeah.
that's just the one over from the one he was in before and repeating the process.
Right.
Could be. We don't know.
Yeah, because there's kind of no rules now. Because one thing I did think of was, we had this one fundamental rule of the story that you can't rewind time in
the Keystone world.
The Keystone world.
Yeah.
But then when Roland is sent back, basically some fragment of his soul or whatever is sent back in time at the beginning of this book. He's clearly going to make different decisions that are going to have different results in the Keystone world. So so that rule is broken. I have no problem with that, partially for like in-story reasons. It's like, well, the Dark Tower can probably do whatever it wants. And then for out-of-story reasons, I just don't care.
Sure.
But to be clear, I don't really think that Roland and the Crimson King are the same person, but I do think
neither do I.
I do think there's a mirroring that the text is doing on purpose by having them both, very strongly stand in for like, the knight of the white and the black knight of the red, or the red knight of the red, I guess. And asking you to compare and contrast them, and especially compare, because there are things about them that are similar. They are both essentially kings who abandoned their kingdom to go to the Dark Tower, right?
And I mean, their obsession with the wizard's glasses is kind of mirrored as well. There's a lot of things that are similar between the two of them, and I do think King's doing that very intentionally. So let's talk about the ending a little bit more here. The first thing I want to say here is something we failed to actually verbalize last week that one of our listeners called us out on. We did not actually say the phrase "Ka is a wheel" was very clearly setting up the way this book ends. I think we gestured toward it, but we didn't actually say it. When you were talking about the loop and the ring structure, we didn't actually say the phrase "Ka is a wheel" is said about 1,000 times throughout the last 3 books, especially. And it's because King is kind of winking at what he's doing there without turning enough attention on it directly to get you to immediately recognize what's going on. Yeah. So that was our bad. We should have said that. I should have said "Ka is a wheel." It's because it's what everyone says. That's the phrase.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't necessarily. I guess as we were nearing the end of the story, and I was realizing that this seemed to be a ring structure story, I was like, oh, that's what "Ka is a wheel" means. I didn't think that it meant we're literally going back in time. That's so that's the thing. Like, I noticed that some people were giving me praise for having, quote unquote, almost guessed it, which we can debate whether that's true or not. But like for, there were a few times in there where I talked about like potential time loops happening, especially I remember in Wolves, I was talking about this.
Yeah, and people went nuts about that for sure.
Which is fun and thanks and everything, but I don't think I deserve like a ton of credit, because the book already had introduced a ton of time travel elements by that point.
Sure.
And so if you introduce a shitload of time travel and an implication of like splitting timelines and remerging timelines and people being taken from different points in time, anybody who's like read a bunch of books and has the opportunity to think about it is going to think about the idea of there being time loops at some point. So yes, I did think about there being potential time loops in the story. Like I think at one point I was thinking that the resolution of Wolves of the Kala was going to be like, I think I might have said even on the podcast that like, what if like every, that they keep dying fighting the wolves over and over, and they have to change like one thing with every loop. And that, like, that's just that I'm just playing with the tools the story gave me there, and I was of course wrong there. But like I just wanted to say, like, King is asking you to think about time travel, and
yes,
that way you're not like disgusted when the ending of the story is a time travel ending, because you're like, yeah, this whole book has been full of time travel, so that feels natural.
Yeah, and one of the things I enjoyed most about your approach to the end of the book is that you were doing this thing that I think the book is absolutely inviting you to do, which is realizing that the book is seeming to be this ring structure, seeming to be this Ka as a wheel, things are repeating, and you took that as a narrative structural conceit, which it absolutely is, but I don't think anyone would have guessed that he's taking this narrative structural conceit and making it literal by the end. And that was the fun part for me, is that I think you were doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, which is like, man, this seems to be repeating a lot of the events of the first book. It seems like we're kind of coming back around again to a lot of the stuff that happened. But certainly that doesn't mean that the book is going to literally plot-wise end right where it began. But of course, that's exactly what Stephen's doing. And I think his willingness to do that, that is something that I think he does very well, is he takes these things that are, high level narrative, structural storytelling conceits. But in the Dark Tower, he takes that and literalizes it, like in the way that fantasy stories take the fantasy metaphor and literalize it, which is something I think is the thing you and I have said the most amount of times on our various podcasts, is like the genre fiction takes a conceit and just literalizes it in cool ways. Stephen King is taking the conceit of storytelling and literalizing it. That is what the Dark Tower is fundamentally. So like, you're absolutely supposed to recognize this ring structure, but then of course he's going to make that the plot itself.
Yes.
Because that's what he's doing.
Yes, absolutely. This is his book on writing, actually.
Yeah.
On writing was a red herring.
Yeah. Perfect. So about the ending, though, I wanted to talk to you about the different interpretations of this ending, because I think, like we kind of mentioned last week, the beautiful thing about the ending is you can kind of take away whatever you want from it, and you can make decisions about what's going to happen on the next wheel. Is Roland ever going to get out of this? And the one thing that I found so interesting about this is we had some listeners kind of come back to me and say, wow, your interpretation was super optimistic. I don't agree with it at all. We had a listener who basically said that this is all, it's just a joke. It's like the idea that the horn is going to magically grant him the ability to quit his addiction is kind of Ka and Stephen King laughing at you one last time. And I'm not sure I agree with that interpretation, but I like it. I like that someone could come up with it. And I kind of wanted to get your read on it.
I mean, I think I've already kind of said what my take is, and so I don't see it that way. I guess I would say this maybe breaks a little bit of the normal rules that I would use to talk about stuff like this, but like, we know that Stephen King is not a fatalist about addiction.
Mm-hmm.
He's an alcoholic who doesn't drink alcohol anymore. Mm-hmm. The meaning of that statement being, he knows that he has this problem and he has this struggle, but he also has mastered himself enough that he doesn't permit himself to do it anymore. And I think for him to write a gigantic opus where the point is that you're just damned by your addiction forever, I just don't feel like that's a story that he would write, or a moral or a theme that he would endorse. I think just the very fact that something has changed in the next loop is practically all we need to know that Roland can get better, and probably has been getting better each time he's gone through the loop.
I agree with you. And like I said, I'm fully on your side with this. To kind of play the role of the individuals making this argument, I do think it is interesting that the way the book shows you that change is not through an active choice that Roland made, right? Like, we don't go back in time to the moment and watch Roland decide to pick up the horn at Jericho Hill, right? We're not treated to that. We're not treated to a moment where we throw Roland back to this moment and see him actively make the choice to bend down and pick up the horn. We're thrown poetically back to where the books all started, and we're told that this time around something's changed because Roland did what he was chastised for not doing back as he's approaching the tower, taking the 3 seconds to bend down and pick up the horn. But we don't actually see him get to actively make that choice. So I think that the interpretation here is arguing that it is false change because our character was presented with something as if they made a choice, but they didn't actually make the choice. My counter to that argument would be, well, I think it's supposed to represent the change that he's already undergone. The giving him the horn is representing the change that he made on this cycle. Like, if the Dark Tower is trying to get him to his point of redemption, is trying to get him to learn his lesson and to change, the horn is kind of a reward for hey, you did a pretty good job that last time.
You did better this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. You saved the breakers. You had that 5-second period of time where you were going to sacrifice yourself to save Jake's life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like that was my feeling. So I was kind of imagining Stephen King sitting there being like, how do I do this? Like, do I start the book and then he goes back to the Battle of Jericho Hill and he decides to pick up the horn, and then I imagine King being like, no, that doesn't work. I have to. It's too perfect for me to want to end the story on the first sentence. I have to do that. And then he just realized, like, I can just have him have the horn. And the implication will be, this is a Roland who would have made that decision.
Right. I think that's the most important part, right? That, yes, we don't actually get to see Roland make that choice, but this is a Roland who did make that choice. Regardless of whether we get to see it or not, we are told through the text that this Roland, as he was walking away from his friend at Jericho Hill, took the time to bend down and pick up that horn. And he will hold that horn, and it will be a constant reminder to him of his decision to take that time, to take that 3 seconds, to take that moment to stop and pick up something.
Yeah.
And that is metaphorically representative of a change of person. And it will literally throughout the story make him think about things a little bit differently.
And just, on the meta level, just the fact that we know that in the poem, Child Roland has a horn, and now our Roland has a horn, and so it lines up better with sort of the way you feel like it's supposed to go.
I do think there's something really interesting and horrible and pessimistic, but interesting to the idea that, like, this interpretation is, Roland, you idiot, you think that just because you have a horn this time, you're going to get over your addiction magically. That just, I'm going to go to the tower again, but this time I'm going to blow the horn. Haha, you idiot, you're still addicted. That is an interesting interpretation. Again, I don't agree with it, but there is something wonderfully cruel in that.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, I think this is one of the fun gifts that the story leaves us with, is it leaves us asking questions like this, like what would have to happen for Roland to actually cry off, because he kind of came close a few times in this story, but then then whenever he came close, it kind of seemed like Ka would step in, and Ka mainly stepped in to avoid letting him have an easy out. Yeah, is how I would phrase it.
Yeah,
but like, you get the sense that, like, if Stephen King, once again, this guy who's just true to his characters first and foremost. So if his character Roland, under his metaphorical fingertips on the keyboard, or his literal fingertips on the keyboard, tells him, I'm not going to go to the tower because it's more important to me that XYZ. Then I think that the writer Stephen King would honor that, and I like so. But it's fun to imagine, like, well, what would that look like? Like, what situation would arise where Roland could actually decide to cry off? At what point in his journey does that happen?
I mean, it's also really nice because, like, metafiction based, like, if Ka is storytelling, the future of Roland is now no longer a slave to what would make a good story, because this story has ended, right? And so this is a Roland that is no longer a slave to that Ka, and therefore has the room to make those better choices, because we don't have to write a story about this next loop. That's not what this is. There's no story there. There's no writing. It's just speculation. It's just the wonderings of a reader. And in those wonderings, anything is possible. We are not a slave to what makes a good story anymore.
You could go full death of the author and just say that if my interpretation is that Roland Roland cries off on the next cycle, then that's true.
then that is 100% what happens
for me anyway. And that's yet again, it's a fun metafictional thing that King has done, where it's like, I don't know, how do you think it ends?
Yep. And maybe there's a person out there who stopped reading when Stephen King told him to, and so in his mind the book ends with Susanna having happiness and Roland getting his tower, and that's all they need to know. I don't think that person exists, but they might. And that's all that matters.
If you actually did that,
please email us. I really want to know.
Yeah. Interestingly, you're definitely spoiled on what happens after that point. But if you didn't actually read it yourself,
that's a good point. If they're listening to this, they know that. they know how it ends.
If they know how it ends, but they didn't read it themselves, does that really count though?
I think that's the loophole.
Yeah.
Right
there you go.
All right. Before we move on to the mailbag, just a few things I wanted to talk about that some people said that weren't really in the form of questions, but just interesting things that I wanted to bring up. A Taraxiary said that they don't have a question to ask, but they had, considering all your Lord of the Rings comparisons, Matt, they had this comment straight from the Lord of the Rings. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead, the road has gone, and I must follow if I can. So there's a Tolkien quote that works perfectly in The Dark Tower.
Yeah. You could also call the whole series There and Back Again.
You could. That's depressing, but you could.
Oh dear.
And then the last thing I wanted to do was chat with you about the word apotheosis, because we had one of our listeners, Ian B, reach out to us that just to talk about that word a little bit here. And Ian says, I wanted to ask you about the word apotheosis. It begins and ends, of course, on the apotheosis of all deserts. But Roland is the apotheosis of all flawed heroes. The series is the apotheosis of all epics. When we read Lord of the Rings, it ends. Great story. But all the pieces are put back in place. The adventure ends. And as seen in the recent trilogy, Star Wars takes the unknown and forgotten and raises them to intergalactic wizards. But all those stories end. This story is the apotheosis of all stories because it kicks ass, but Ka, as you put it, is the reader or the act of reading. I think back to the idea that to read is to destroy. There's a great sculpture. I apologize if I forgot the artist. I think it was Robert Rauschenberger, who also did Erased de Kooning. It's a chalice with the entire novel torn up and singed in the cup. Every book, every story is ingested and destroyed by the reader. But how brilliant The Dark Tower is to demand that you reread the book, not for Easter eggs, but for hope. The apotheosis of all endings, because the next time it could be different. I love that. And I just see you chat about that word apotheosis, because I think he picked that in The Gunslinger because it sounded good.
Yeah.
but then he brought it back. So there is something to that word usage here that I think we can pick apart.
Yeah. The culmination, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the sort of religious, undertone to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I mean, it serves a perfect role just in being an unusual word, and thus you immediately realize what's happened when he talks about the desert that was the apotheosis of all deserts.
Yeah, it's a great cue to make you where you get it right before Roland gets it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really cool idea, though. I mean, like you pointed out, this is a story about storytelling, and so it's perfect that it would sort of transcend in all these ways that we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think they say Roland is the apotheosis of antihero in some ways, but I do think like Roland is trying to reach his apotheosis in the biblical sense, right? Which is the kind of deification of someone. He's trying to reach his best, most pure, ultimate form, which is individual who is able to cry off, right? At least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so I think it fits, like Roland is the apotheosis of the antihero. This story has the apotheosis of endings, but it is not yet to its apotheosis either.
I mean, yes, in a sense that this whole story is a purgatory for Roland, maybe for other characters too, but definitely for Roland, like very textually for Roland, it's a purgatory. You could even argue that, Eddie went through his purgatory and now he's free, which is one of the things that makes me wonder if maybe every cycle doesn't get different characters. And like, Susanna went through her purgatory and now she's free. So she doesn't have to be roped back into this again. But Roland, he is going through his purgatory over and over. And, the reason, the root word of purgatory is basically the same as purification. We're purifying Roland. We're bringing him toward his apotheosis apotheosis. I rarely say that word. Through these like cycles of basically torment, yes, but torment for the purpose of purification. So
yeah,
I do like connecting the word apotheosis to the idea of this being a purgatory. That's a really cool idea.
It is. I love that. And I love what you said about his Tet being free, because I think there is this really interesting like kind of contradiction there, where on the one hand I want them to be free, on the other hand I love them and I kind of want Roland to get to go on his adventure with them again, but aren't I just damning them to their own purgatory by wanting that? That's where I really love what the book is. The things the book makes you think about yourself as Ian said, consume this book, ingest this book. You kind of the feelings of your characters be damned. I want to see them. I want to see Jake again, but I want to see Eddie again. But that means I'm damning Eddie to die again, and Jake to die again.
Yeah, I mean, within your mind, right? Like that's
sure.
I tend to think about it the same way that you just described it, but obviously they're not really dying because they're not really alive, but we still feel it. So the only thing we're damning is ourselves to feel that pain again.
Sure.
Which on some level we enjoy because we're feeling something powerful, which is actually desirable.
Yes.
So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know where to go with that. I do think it's fun for me to imagine. It's interesting. I think we might diverge on this because it's fun for me to imagine that it's different characters every time. Maybe every time he gets to the tower, there's a different group of people whose names he says, and it's fun to imagine that, like, oh, what if there's like who are the next group of people going to be? They're probably just as interesting as these characters, except totally different in some way.
Yeah, I mean, that's fun to imagine, but it's also fun to imagine a version in which Roland gets to be the father of Jake Chambers.
That's true.
His true father, and they get a lifetime of father and son together.
That is true. It is true that sort of based on this book, your ideal thing is he makes the right choice and saves Jake and just turns away from the tower.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll never know, and that's what I love. I'm so glad he didn't say any of that, because if he just said, yeah, it's going to be the same three again, but things are going to be different, wouldn't you just be a little like, oh, like, I mean, I want it to be in some ways, but I love the open-endedness of it.
I mean, I feel like there's a sort of naturalistic way for it to go where the because he has this reminder of Cuthbert, and because he's now a person who is capable of waiting 3 seconds to get what he wants, he actually does grab Jake's hand, and then the man in black gets away. But then it turns out the man in black was full of shit, and he's actually able to draw the others through the doors. But this time he has Jake with him, which just changes the whole story from that point on. Yep. In a ton of different ways, right? Yep. So like that's sort of the like, well, how would I write this while injecting minimal creativity? That's pretty much how that would go.
Yeah, I mean, I love that so many of Roland's choices are presented to him as obvious. Like it is obvious to him in that moment in the Gunslinger that if he takes the time to save Jake, he will lose the man in black, and he's only certain of that because of his innate inner certainty, as well as the man in black saying it's now or never. And that dude's a fucking liar. That's who he is. He lies. So like we make these assumptions and we treat this and we're like, yes, of course he had to choose between the tower and Jake. That was the choice. But was it though? Right. And I think you're right that is kind of the linchpin, maybe the apotheosis of choices that could shoot out and change everything.
Because the man in black didn't actually tell him anything useful, right? There was some weird time warp effect. Yeah, but like you kind of end up feeling like Walter O'Dim Randall Flagg, whatever, he's so full of shit, and he's like not nearly as powerful as he seems to be.
Mhm.
So like everything that he took credit for is probably had nothing to do with him, was going to happen anyway.
Yeah, like he told him, you're gonna go to a beach and find some doors, and you're gonna take people from those doors. But like, couldn't he just figure that out on his own?
Yeah.
When he got to the beach and then saw a door, like he didn't. It is interesting that the more we learn about Randall Flagg, the more we realize that he's not really there. Like there was always a contradiction there where like the bad guy is telling Roland what he needs to do to succeed in his quest, and you're always like, huh, that's weird. But maybe it's not that. Maybe he's just telling him stuff he didn't actually need to know.
Yeah.
And there's no reason that Palaver created the doors, because the doors were not made by the Man in Black. They were made by Ka, Gan, whatever.
Right. I mean, I think at the time we were puzzling about it. We were like, what is the meaning of the tarot cards? And it's like, okay, well, the tarot cards did predict who was going to be in the doors, but so what? Fundamentally, like it didn't change any decision Roland made. Yeah.
All right. Before we get into the mailbag, I want to talk to you about the author's note at the very end of the story, because I had you read this before this episode, and I wanted to just chat about it a little bit, because I think King talks about some of this stuff in some interesting ways. And we don't like to bring this external stuff into it that much, but now that we're at the end of the book, I think we can safely talk about this stuff and not have it impact any of our interpretations or anything. So let's talk about a couple things that King talks about in this author's note. The first is metafiction. I'm just going to read this section real quick and then we can chat about it. There's a smarmy academic term for this, metafiction. I hate it. I hate the pretentiousness of it. I'm in the story only because I've known for some time now, consciously since writing Insomnia in 1995, unconsciously since temporarily losing track of Father Donald Callahan near the end of Salem's Lot, that many of my fictions refer back to Roland's world and Roland's story. Since I was the one who wrote them, it seemed logical that I was part of the Gunslingers Ka. My idea was to use the Dark Tower stories as kind of a summation, a way of unifying as many of my previous stories as possible between the arc of some uber tale. I never meant that to be pretentious, and I hope it isn't, but only as a way of showing how life influences art and vice versa. This is so wonderfully King here, right?
Yeah.
I put myself in my own story. I hope it wasn't pretentious. And the thing is, I don't think it is.
No.
I don't think it is.
No, I don't think it is. He's clearly having fun with it. And it's sort of like and maybe I'm deluding myself here, but I feel like if I sat down with a blank sheet of paper and I never read this book and I thought to myself, I'm going to write the most metafictional metafiction that ever metafictioned. What's one of the first things you're going to write on that blank piece of paper of like ideas? It's going to be, well, you have to be a character in the story, because otherwise, how is it, like, in what sense is it even metafiction? And obviously King is doing this so much because he talks to the reader all the time, and the conceit of like storytelling itself is baked into the story as like a magical force.
Yep.
And so I mean, first of all, pretentious is a word that I have no use for anyway. So I'm just like, is it pretentious? I don't know. I like it. Whatever. It's fine.
Well, wasn't the original like pretentious wasn't negative at first. It became negatively connotated.
I don't know.
I believe the word origin, the pretentious, when it was first used, it was meant to be more positive. It was meant to be viewed more positively than it's become. It's become to have negative connotation.
It's interesting because I'm looking up the word pretense. Pretentious is different from pretense, I guess. Pretentious, attempting to impress by affecting greater importance, talent, culture, etc., than is actually possessed. And what I would say is like, no, it's his choice to do this is not affecting anything that isn't actually on the page. It is just what it is. So how could it be pretentious? I don't know, man.
It's a word that's kind of lost meaning outside of like the common cultural acceptance of what it means, which is just your jerk that thinks you're better than anyone else, which is, it's, I think here's what I think. I think the reason why this works is because Stephen King hates the concept of metafiction, which is kind of bullshit. First of all, he's not saying that he hates metafiction.
Right.
He can't hate metafiction because that's what he did in this story. What he hates is the labeling of it. He hates this word that you and I have used time and time again, because what he's doing is just talking about storytelling. And as he says at the end here, showing how life influences art and vice versa. That's what he's doing. And then us academics need to attach a definition to reference and to study that act. And so we throw this word metafiction on it. And I get it. And I think it's because he hates that part of it. He's not doing it because he's like, yes, I'm going to analyze the power of storytelling. He's just saying, like, this is a story that is essentially about me. At some point it became about me. So it just made sense to put me into it.
Yeah.
And that's all he's doing.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, exactly. You imagine him being like, I want to write a story that's about how powerful stories can be and how important they are to me. And then somebody being like, oh, so you're writing a metafictional story, and him just being like, whatever.
No, I'm writing about me.
Yeah.
Stop throwing your academic words at me.
Right. Yeah. Stop trying to put me in a box.
Yeah, I think you're right. All right. So let's see what he has to say about the ending. In a sense, there's nothing left to say now that Roland has reached his goal. And I hope the reader will see that by discovering the Horn of Eld, the gunslinger may finally be on his way to his own resolution, possibly even to redemption. It was all about reaching the tower, you see, mine as well as Roland's, and that has finally been accomplished. You may not like what Roland found at the top, but that's a different matter entirely. And don't write me any angry letters about it either, because I won't answer them. There's nothing left to say on the subject. I wasn't crazy about the ending either, if you want to know the truth, but that's the right ending. The only ending, in fact. You have to remember that I don't make these things up. Not exactly. I only write down what I see. So, I mean, I think I don't want this to influence people's interpretations of the ending because death of the author, blah, blah, blah. But I think the way I approach storytelling is not that I want to be told what the author meant, but I want to see if I can discover what the author meant through the context of the text. And this does seem to indicate that what he was trying to do with the words in the text of the ending is that hope and redemption and resolution are within Roland's grasp. And that's what the horn is meant to symbolize. So not to poop on anyone's interpretations, but it seems like that's what the text wants you to get to.
Yeah. I mean, that was the feeling that was just the feeling I was left with, setting aside all of that other stuff. Like, it's a very sad book, actually. And I all of that sadness taken into account, the way the very ending is written gives you this feeling of like all of that terrible stuff could maybe be averted potentially. And
it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to, exactly. It doesn't have to be that way. Maybe it will be. You're not sure. He's not telling you for sure. And I mean, what's interesting is I think right here in this author's note, he doesn't tell us for sure either, right? He's just kind of like, yeah, maybe he'll get redemption, maybe not. That's kind of up to you to decide.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I love also that he admits that he's not crazy about the ending either. Like, I think this is just what happens when you're a by the seat of your pants writer, where you just, oh, that's the end. It's the right ending. It's the only ending, but I'm not happy about it either. I love, like, because he loves Roland. He loves this character. This character's been so important to him, and he doesn't want to see him like this, but it's right. It feels right. And that's exactly what you said as soon as you got there. So it's perfect. Yeah. I love it. I love that he echoes that sentiment. Yeah, right. I think it's a perfect ending to this story. I think that if he had ended the story with Roland crying off the tower, then the book, the series that preceded that ending would have had to be a bit different than the one that we got. Yeah. I think that's like, as much as I am hopeful for the future, and as much as I have stated and I firmly declare that the next loop will be the final loop, he will get his redemption. It's very clear through everything we saw over the course of these 7 books that Roland was not there yet this time around. And he was not making the choices he needed to make. He was not putting in the work he needed to put in to really break free from this addiction. He was not there yet. And so there is this wonderful sense in this ending of both you're hopeful for Roland because you see he has the symbol of hope, but also you're kind of like, yeah, this is kind of what he deserves. And I think that's that contradiction and that confusion and that difficultness with which you approach the character, even at the end, is so in line with everything that was Roland from the very first book. I think that's why it's perfect.
Right. Yeah.
Because you want to see him succeed, but also you think he's getting what he deserves.
Yeah. I mean, we would need to buy that his character had changed, right? And and that did not happen. So that would have to be a different story. That would be a different story than what we got.
Yep. Then King ends this whole thing by talking about himself. He says readers will speculate on how real the Stephen King who appears in these pages. The answer is not very, although the one Roland and Eddie met in Bridgeton, Song of Susanna, is very close to the Stephen King I remember being at the time. I just love that. That idea that you change over time and you can create a character version of yourself.
I mean, and he's very mean to that version of himself too.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's the alcoholic Stephen King who a little bit grandiose also, which it's like kind of adorable, but also obviously has some problems that all of our characters are able to identify easily just by looking at him. So yeah, that's him judging his younger self, and I love that. Yeah. And then he ends with this little bit here that I don't have much to say about this. I just think it's beautiful and I want to read it. My books are my way of knowing you. Let them be your way of knowing me as well. It is enough. And on behalf of Roland and all his quartet, now scattered, say sorry. I thank you for coming along and sharing this adventure with me. I never worked harder on a project in my life, and I know, none better, alas, that it has not been entirely successful. What work of make-believe ever is? And yet, for all of that, I would not give back a single minute of the time that I have lived in Roland's Wear and Wind. Those days in Midworld and the Endworld were quite extraordinary. Those were days when my imagination was so clear I could smell the dust and hear the creak of leather. It's just a beautiful way to finish your last thoughts on this time of your life. I really love it. Yeah, it is kind of great. It's funny how when you consider how metafictional this book has been, you have to ask yourself, like, well, do you consider the author's endnote to be part of the book then?
That's true.
Because he could have.
Is this Fred King?
Yeah, is this Fred King writing this? Exactly.
That's fun. I never thought about it that way.
Which puts it in a different context, because then it's not really death of the author anymore.
No, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. I don't know. I think we can all decide what we think of that.
Well, no, wait. Then it would be death of the author, because Fred King is not Stephen King. Yeah,
that is true.
Good.
I love that line, though. My books are my way of knowing you. Let them be your way of knowing me.
Yeah.
And this is all part of his, hey, leave me alone.
Yeah.
I played with the geography of Maine so you wouldn't come knocking on my door because I don't want to talk to you. This is actually like, if the stars align and we're ever able to interview Stephen King, I don't know how much I want to ask him about, like, I would ask him about the writing process, right? But I don't want like secret insider information about the Dark Tower because of this line right here, like I don't know. I think it's beautiful and I don't want to have him explain more of the world to me.
Yeah, I agree completely. I have a maybe unusual lack of desire to ask creators about their actual creation and way more interest in asking about like
the act of creation,
the act of creation or just their lives. Like the sorts of details that they might not think are significant, but which like what are Stephen King's favorite books? I mean, maybe he's answered that question somewhere, but like I feel like the answer to that question would be way more useful to me than like knowing like what happened to the vampires. That like no, yeah.
I agree. And with that, it's time to move on, Matt. Let's do some mailbags. You ready?
Yep.
All right, we're going to start with LeBron's HGH gut. Does LeBron have an HGH gut? I guess so.
Maybe he does now. I don't know. I haven't looked at a picture of LeBron lately.
LeBron's HGH gut asks, what do you think the next iteration looks like? Personally, I think he doesn't leave Jake, which means he has backup on the beach and the lobstrosities don't poison him. Everything goes smoother from that one choice after that. There's also the chance that Roland is infinitely trapped. in my opinion. Maybe he never learns. After all, he is stubborn. So LeBron kind of captured both of those, the optimistic and the pessimistic. So Matt, what we kind of circled around this, but what is your guess about what loop 20, let's say, is?
Yeah, he probably saves Jake. He loses the Man in Black, and maybe him and Jake don't have the best relationship at that point, because yes, he did save Jake, but he was kind of a huge dickhole when they were under the mountain. So they have a bit of a rough relationship, which they need to kind of work on. He doesn't lose his fingers, which is an interesting wrinkle, because it actually is like good that he lost his fingers, because then he needed to rely on the others more.
Sure.
So that could be a fun kind of permutation, is that he's actually more self-reliant. Like functionally, storytelling wise, it was really important that he be that sick, because he needed to rely on Eddie to get the antibiotics.
Yeah.
If he doesn't need Eddie for the antibiotics, that changes that whole dynamic. So yeah, it's fun how like we haven't really gone that far into time, and we've already come up with a lot of things that are significantly different. So
in your version, does he draw people through the doors, and are they different people?
In my if I were literally writing the next loop, I think he would draw different people through the doors.
Okay.
I think maybe it would be Jake again, but it would not be Eddie and Susanna, and Eddie and Susanna are already having their happily ever after in some other dimension. So
cool.
So nothing was actually lost here.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think my version, I think if I had to write it out, it would still be Eddie and Susanna. I agree with you. I think he saves Jake this time around, and that ripples out in ways that I'm not even sure I could really complete. But I mean, it means he doesn't need to draw Jake in the Wastelands. It means, gosh, it has so many different meanings.
Right.
So many different ones.
That they don't need to do the whole key thing. So Eddie doesn't need to face up against his struggle with Henry, which means Susanna never gets pregnant with a demon baby because they didn't go into the stone circle.
Yeah.
Which means there's no Mordred, which means Oy doesn't die. I mean, that's a sign of a good story, actually, is that if you pick at one thread, the whole thing starts to unravel like immediately, because it's all interwoven, which it really, really is. So
yeah, totally. And maybe we'll circle back to that, because I think there is something to be said that our characters had work to do, right? They had to save the existence.
Yeah.
And what does all this mean with them needing to save existence? That's a question coming up here in a bit, so we'll circle back to that.
Okay.
But first, Smog Goblin.
Smog Goblin says, "Hi, my mailbag question is, thinking back through the series, are there any points now where you think Roland or any other characters knew that this was just another loop? One for me would be Roland's toast in River Crossing. I've enjoyed the show immensely, and I'm looking forward to the next book." And the toast is as follows. "Will you drink to the earth and to the days which have passed upon it?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, trembling with emotion. "Will you drink to the fullness which was, and to friends who have passed on? Will you drink to good company well met? Will these things set us on, old mother?" And they go on to say, an uncharacteristic show of emotion from Roland is so telling with hindsight. Also, are the residents of River Crossing so old because they've been part of multiple loops? I think Talitha says that there was a gunslinger who passed through 100 years prior to Roland. Was it Roland on another loop? That's man, I hadn't thought about this at all. So that's really interesting. I don't know. What do you think, Scott?
No, I don't. So I think there are moments throughout the story where characters are not directly aware that they are in other loops, but as you talked about last week, feel this weird sense of deja vu, feel this weird sense of we've done this before, we've been here before. I know things I shouldn't know already. There's this weird feeling that permeates the books that is not direct knowing, but some deep subconscious awareness. Is this one of those moments, the speech there? I don't know. I think you could pass Roland's show of emotion here as being something separate from he knows this is a loop. I mean, you could assign it to the fact that it's been so long since he's been in the company of other people and been responsible for being the gunslinger that he was before the world moved on, that he's just really emotional to this moment and to being around these people and to fulfilling this role again. But
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that like the people of River Crossing are aware that there's a loop going on, and they're just living in this kind of purgatory, and every 100 years or so a Roland like a gunslinger comes along. I don't think that's happening. No, it's interesting. I don't hate it, but I don't think it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he literally went back in time to like his soul re-entered his body at the beginning. That was my interpretation. And also, you know, I think maybe there's a chance that he felt some echo of having done this before.
Yeah.
That some part of him was maybe aware that this was an important moment. But not consciously.
Yeah. All right. Aggravated Hipster asks, while Roland is given plenty of chances to stop his quest and renounce the tower, if he had done so before Jake saves Psy King, the beams would have fallen and reality would be destroyed. To me, that seems like a poor reward for his redemption. In my opinion, the only real chance he gets to renounce the tower without bringing down reality along with him is when Susanna goes through the door to New York. Do you agree? Why or why not?
Interesting.
Lots to consider here. Couple things. I mean, the first thing we have to consider is the very nature of this loop means that, like, on a macro universe scale, Roland's already saved the tower and prevented the destruction of the Earth, right? Like,
right.
Is the tower choosing to put itself in imminent world-ending danger again just to punish Roland? I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's this idea of like all things serve the beam, all things serve Ka. There was never any way that the beams were going to break.
Yeah.
Like that would not have like if Roland had been struck by a stray bullet and killed in Tull, something else would have happened to save the beams. So like, I mean, that's sort of a cheeky answer, but also I think like any point that he turns back, you have the opportunity to just change the story such that the beam still gets saved some other way.
And I think the mistake that Roland makes again and again and again is the assumption that this is the way it has to be because this is the only way to save the tower. Like we have to abandon Jake. Eddie has to die again. Jake has to die again. Like I think there are ways to save the tower and still renounce it without damning all your friends to die and suffer. Like, I think that the problem with Roland is he again and again just says it's Ka, right? And Ka has been this force we've talked about, and it is both true that it is and not true, because Ka is trying to get him, the tower is trying to get him to change. So to write everything off as just, well, this has to happen this way because Ka. Well, no. I mean, I think you could make the argument, and I think one of our question askers did, is that the reason Jake is taken from Roland at the end of the book, the reason why Jake has to sacrifice himself to save Stephen King is because Roland let him go in the first place.
Yeah.
And so it's like, fuck you. Here's what you get now.
Yeah. Right. No free lunches.
Right.
That would be bad storytelling in a sense.
Sure. So I think the thing to say is we are presented with this view of the world that is, this is the only way it could happen because that's what Roland believes. And so to say that the only time he could have actually cried off is when Susanna decided to, I don't think that's true, because I think the choices he made along that path could have changed everything. So we've already said there's how much the choice to save Jake ripples out and just completely fundamentally changes how the rest of the story plays out. So yeah. I think that the loop in which Roland is successful and gets to his resolution and his redemption is going to look so dramatically different from this loop that it's not even useful to say that there's one specific moment in which he could have or should have cried off.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Cool.
All right.
But good question.
Yeah. It's fun. It's fun to think about these things, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
From Mike. So I'm sitting here thinking on the nature of Toadash space, and I had a pretty terrifying thought. What if Toadash space is where lost and forgotten characters end up? If complete characters end up in one of the levels of the tower, then maybe unfinished characters are doomed to wander in darkness. Unfinished but still existing, they have no form. Knowing that the world, all the world, is so close but impossibly far away, they become insane monsters. That's why Roland and friends are so terrified of it. They know that they could so easily wind up there. All it takes to be forgotten is writer's block or a truck. That means any story King doesn't finish winds up in Toadash space. Talk about an unending well of evil to draw on, like what I did there. That's fun.
That's terrifying, but I like something. I like that idea that like Toadash is the space of unfinished stories, of unformed stories. That is this space of chaos and monstrousness that doesn't enter a story until structure has been placed upon it, form has been placed upon it. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it kind of even works in with this idea that I have of it being like the Lovecraftian idea where the less you know about Toadash monsters, the better. Like it really ruins the scariness of like a monster from the outer darkness if you have 6 pages of description about what it looks like and where it's from and what it does. It's just like, oh, so it's just like an animal. That's boring. Yeah.
I think that's a very cool read that I think fits. So I kind of like that. So Sleeping Lovely 19 says, this ending fucks me up a lot, and I love it. It was on the back of my mind the entire time I've listened to you guys. I would sort of laugh and shock when Matt got scarily close to the truth. You did, Matt. You did.
Yay.
Would you guys say there's a horrifying size to the ending and its implications? Yeah, that's a good point. You know, remember when the first thing we learn about the tower is that it is size, and this ending certainly has a lot of size to it.
Yeah, if you think about it, I mean, every reader has their own impression of what this implies, right? Which means the scope of all the possible interpretations of this ending is possibly bigger than any story ever. Which is quite a
there you go,
quite a sizable implication.
The apotheosis of stories.
Exactly. There you go. Man of Zimmer says, in honor of the law of 3, I'll ask Matt this question again for the 3rd time. What do you think now about the significance of 19? Yes, I was wrong the previous times. I think that King just noticed that this number came up during particularly what's the word? Important, I guess. Just particularly important times in his life, or you know, I think I have my own I have my own number here, but it's just an integer, and so it doesn't matter. It's not 19. Although my name does have 19 letters, we have to remind everyone. So yeah, I mean, he took this, and because he's doing this metafiction thing, he decided to work it in there, and have that be kind of a symbol or a motif.
Yeah. I really love, we talked about this last week, but I just really love the 19 loops read. There's no textual support for it at all. But I like it.
Yeah. I'd be way more sold if there were something on the last, in the last few pages that indicated like 20 of something, but but no.
Yeah. Like if we flash back to Tull and we see 20, one day you will say 20.
Yeah. Right.
Love it. Drugs Possum says, something I realized this time around is that Roland's power of intuition may not really be a power at all. Every time Roland knows something throughout the series, he either dismisses it or explains it away as Ka, which in a way is accurate. Roland knows all these things intuitively because he's been there before. Though his Ka-tet may get flashes of deja vu, they never know things before they happen the way Roland does. This tells me that each time around the cycle, it's a different Jake, a different Eddie, and a different Susanna, but always the same Roland. Though the others may get to catch glimpses of their lives the way Jake does in the Wastelands, they always reach the clearing or cry off. Only Roland goes on. Yeah, I like that a lot. It's not really a question, but I like your interpretation.
Yeah. I don't know why I hadn't considered this, but I actually like the idea that he does draw Jake, Eddie, and Susanna, but it's different versions of them with maybe slightly different life experiences. Like maybe this Eddie is not a junkie because the lesson Roland needs to learn this time is not the same lesson.
Sure.
Or maybe he is, who knows? But that's a fun thought. That's a really
and that has
thought.
size to it, right? Because that means that like there have been 19 different entire worlds in which Jake and Eddie and Susanna lived in, and they're pulled from each different world each time.
Yeah.
And slightly different version, slightly different person. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it. And I just love the idea that like you can kind of explain away this magical intuition he has, because he's like, yeah, because I, on some subconscious ingrained level, I've done all this before.
Yeah, I think that's I'm gonna have to, on my reread, pay more attention to that, because the intuition thing, I think, was something I didn't notice as front and center as I was supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next from Jerk Stabworthy. They say, maybe you have some thoughts on this. The idea of Susanna and her alter egos being unreliable narrators of their own memories, specifically before they're merging into one. Odetta's memories of her imprisonment and torture in Oxford are relayed almost, if not entirely, through Odetta's perspective. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if ever there was a time for Detta to come forward, it would have been when the Honk Mothas had her tied to a chair in a jail cell. I wouldn't even put it past her to have urinated in her pants out of spite of the officer who had to look after her. Of course, I'm not downplaying the awfulness of the racist cops who actually did those awful things, but I like to think Detta seriously put a scare to those good old boys before they let her go. Are there any other plot points that you think Detta and Odetta might have had a part in that weren't textually explicit?
This is a really fun question because it is textually explained in Drawing of the Three that Odetta makes up shit to understand things she like. When Odetta comes back first, she makes up this whole story about how she's allergic to the lobster meat and she's been trying to eat it the entire time, but she just keeps throwing it up. And then this time when they feed it to her, she's like, oh, they must be different lobsters. She makes up this whole narrative in her head. And Detta does the same thing, right? Detta has this whole narrative playing in her head that Eddie and Roland have all this wonderful meat that they're not sharing with her. The only thing they're sharing with her is this poison stuff. So these two are creating their own narratives in their head. So it does introduce this idea that some of the stuff that we're told from Odetta could have been just bullshit that she made up. It's so intrinsic and important to her character that I'm not sure I would like that being the truth, but it is true that King has introduced the possibility here. Yeah.
I mean, it's not that I don't think the idea is very fun. It is very fun. I would say that I don't know if Detta was really taking on the role of being a protector for Odetta at that point. Like, I think it was more like the horror of what had happened to her just caused her to retreat into this other person when she needed to be protected. I don't know. I'm kind of contradicting myself. I guess I agreed. Like you said, it seems like it's so core part of that was a sacrifice that Odetta wanted to make, which goes really well in with the themes of sacrifice in the story, where because she chose to make it, I don't feel like, even though it was really shitty, I don't necessarily feel like Detta would have jumped in there to protect her from something that she chose willingly. But it is fun to imagine that Detta, did something terrifying. And this was all just kind of glossed over in Odetta's memory.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I think the difference between how Odetta and Detta both choose to approach the same problem, which is this racist society that existed and continues to exist, is so fundamental to who they are, right? Odetta's is this kind of passive, Martin Luther Kingian. We said this at the beginning, and I'll clarify again that we're overgeneralizing, but it's the MLK Malcolm X difference, right? It's this passive form of silent resistance versus this very active, violent. And again, this is the this is the media depiction. I don't want to get people upset with me. This is the media depiction of who Malcolm X was, not who he actually was as a person. But this Deda's is resisting against racism, but she's doing it in a much more violent, active way versus Odeda's. So I don't know if Deda, appearing in this moment of passive resistance works as well. But I mean, it is such an interesting idea because they do build these narratives. Yeah. So it's possible. It's certainly possible.
Yeah. All right. Next question from Bricks. They say, back in Wolves of the Kala, I believe it was, you guys had a discussion on Eddie and how he was able to learn horse riding and other such stuff as fast as he did. Matt almost mentioned time loops, like skirting right around the edge of it. How close were you to shutting yourself to shutting yourself at this point, Scott? I almost
meant shitting
yourself at this point. I almost yelled out on the bus when he was so close to predicting the end.
Yeah, I mean, this is the most fun and also challenging part about what we do, which is that at times it is very, very hard to carry the conversation on when someone gets so close to exactly what's going to happen. I'll say again that Matt and I do not have video when we're recording these. We're just talking audio. So I can very easily like mute my mic and react in my craziness when Matt skirts very, very close to something that he doesn't have to see and we don't have to deal with. And then I unmute when I've collected myself, and then we just carry on with the story. But I think if you ever go through and re-listen to this, you will see some moments where you can, knowing how it ends now, you can see that I am kind of pausing for a little bit more extended period or fumbling over my words a little bit more than I would have because I'm trying to get things on track without accidentally saying something that screws everything up for you.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, just for those who don't know, when we were doing our We've Got Worm podcast where we were in opposite roles, Scott nailed a couple of plot points like very precisely too. And I had to be like, I basically just learned a sort of mask to put on where I would just be like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. Like just make my mouth say that, even though in my mind I'm like, what the fuck, Scott? Because otherwise, because and maybe there's a slight delay there also, but like not more than, there's all kinds of reasons why one might pause for a fraction of a second in the middle of a conversation. So yeah,
I think if we were sitting in the same room and having that conversation, it'd be a completely different story.
Yeah, I think so.
Because we're like, it's like this, it's kind of removed from an intimate person-to-person conversation. We can kind of dodge those bullets. And I think like now that we're at the end, I don't think there was any major plot point that you were spoiled on, right, Matt? I think we got it pretty clean at the end.
Yeah, no, I don't think. I'm trying to think I don't think I was spoiled on anything.
I will say, you folks on our Reddit thread were being super loose with every time Matt mentioned anything to do with a loop in the last couple weeks, would comment on Reddit, and I'm like, oh my god, I hope he doesn't read this.
Yes, I don't think I was reading the Reddit threads. I've been pretty.
I told you not to.
Yeah,
but
I've been pretty actively not reading anything about anything. So yeah.
All right. We have Mick CQ who says, I had such a strong feeling of pity for Roland in the end, from appearing so relentlessly strong-willed throughout much of the book to pleading for mercy as soon as he thought he had reached his ultimate goal. It completely flipped my image of him. I listened to Johnny Cash's version of Hurt recently, and I see it as a Roland song now. It captures him perfectly. As a side question, do you think the book reflects Stephen King's process as a writer in any way? Like Roland, I wonder how much he rides the line between feeling a bond with his characters and keeping an emotional distance when he knows their story concludes at the end of each book, while he, prolifically, moves on and starts all over again with new characters. It was mentioned last week that Roland needs to learn to stop and smell the roses. Does King feel the same way about himself, or has he perhaps realized that since his accident? It's a really interesting question. What do you think, Matt?
This is a very complicated question. Yeah, I was literally just reading a part in On Writing where he talks about his kind of meta process where basically he'll write a first draft. I'm going to butcher this because I don't remember it as well as I should, since I did just read it, but basically he writes a first draft and then puts the first draft in a drawer for 6 weeks and works on another thing, like another short story or something, while waiting, just like literally just waiting for time to pass. And then when he looks at the book again, he'll feel a little bit of freshness and distance from it, enough distance that he can not feel emotional about chopping out the things that don't work, and be a little bit objective about it. So I know that he does that. I don't know. It's interesting. Like I've written stories off and on throughout my life, and there's some characters where I do sort of see them as like very separate from me. Like this, it's just like, oh, this is a character I'm writing. And then there's some of them where I'm like, this is a person that I know. Definitely prefer the latter. Like I feel like I've succeeded when I can do those characters. But as for King, I don't know. I don't have a clear. It's a very interesting question. I find myself fumbling to come up with an answer. What do you think, Scott?
I don't think King thinks he needs to stay with his characters more than he already does, right? I don't think the message of the book in his mind is I need to stop and appreciate my characters before running on to the next thing. I don't think so. I think to King, I think the message is I can't keep chasing this unknowable huge thing in the distance, and I need to enjoy my life. That doesn't mean I need to stick with the characters I have and stop trying to invent new characters, stop trying the next book. I don't think so. I do think Roland is a character in which Stephen King feels an immense personal connection to. I think part of the metafiction is him admitting to the fact that, hey, this guy kind of looks like me. I put a lot of who I am into this person, and that's why he kind of scares me in many ways, because I don't know how he's going to react to certain situations. And what does that say about me when I put so much of myself into this character? So I think his ability to finish this book is him getting to his tower. And I think one of the things that Stephen King did learn is that to put this character aside. I mean, he comes back to it. We have another book to read and another short story to talk about. But I do think part of this is recognizing that, okay, that's done. The Dark Tower is done, and I need to cry off from this instead of going back to this again and again and again. It's been this thing for me, and now I've done it, and I need to be done. So that's where I think he lands on this whole thing.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Cool.
All right, next question from Knuckles 560. They say, how do you believe Roland's inability to think around corners and slow plotting nature play into how many trips it will ultimately take him to cry off the tower? While having the horn and the ability to look back and remember the past and his loved ones is a big step forward, how many more times does Jake fall under the mountain until he learns that lesson? And how many times before did he pull Jack Mort through the door before he finally was able to see past him being a useful tool and that he was evil and didn't deserve to live? I've always considered two things. Number one, the cycle is Roland's purgatory, since he will never be free until he learns all the lessons he should, and until that point, he would never be able to pull himself away from finding the rose-encircled tower. And number two, the Horn of Eld is a symbol of hope that he will eventually get it through his thick skull, as my parents would say, and learn the lessons that he obviously blows by with his single-minded, unthinking, and undeterred nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why Roland is in this position in the first place is because he can't think around corners, right?
Yeah.
Is that he has this slow plotting nature that he's going to keep walking forward no matter what the clear signs all around him. I do think I love that idea that once upon a time, Jack Mort was just a member of the quartet because Roland didn't stop to think this monster. Mm-hmm. He just saw him as, hey, this is useful. Like, I love Roland's reaction in Drawing of the Three, where he says, what does it say about me that I am meant to be tet with this person. He doesn't say tet because that word wasn't used yet. But what does it say about me that this is the type of people I am meant to pull into my quest?
Yeah.
And I do see an earlier version of the character who isn't even aware enough to question that, who has completely abandoned the idea of love so innately that he's just like, oh, cool, this guy's going to be useful. I can send him up into something tall and have him drop bricks on people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've talked a bit about the next loop, but I think it's equally fun to think about the previous loops, where, like you said, the Jack Mort being on his side, him being a much worse person, him being even less purified by the cycle. And yeah, I mean, I think there's something very thematic about the idea of just failing to slow down and consider the consequences of your actions that has led him to be stuck in this loop in the first place, where like he's just the kind of person who will just unthinkingly take the next step forward when he really needs to be thinking. And I think, that maybe you could even say the few times in the story where he does very specifically think and make a choice that isn't an obvious choice, like choosing to kill Jack Mort because he thinks he deserves to die out of his sense of justice. Like that's sort of not on the path. Like if you asked him in that moment, like, Roland, don't you think you were supposed to pull this guy through if the doors are giving you these people? Like, don't you think this is on your path to the tower? He would probably be like, yeah, I probably was supposed to pull this guy through, but he's too evil. And so like they're basically all his moments of like triumph and goodness are deviations from the obvious that's been set before him. So yeah, I definitely think this idea of him having to learn to be a more thoughtful person, like I think that's part of his purgatory, is learning to slow down and be more thoughtful and be less plotting and thoughtless.
Yeah, I'm with you there for sure. All right, next we have Sheev Millerband, who says, while I love Callahan and the role he plays in the series, it always felt weird to me that he was considered a member of the quartet, especially since his time with them was so limited and his most eventful time was running through New York with Jake for a couple of hours. Jake felt Kashum as they approached the Dixie Pig, but there was still no breaking of the tet when Callahan died as there was with Eddie. Any thoughts on this and how you guys feel about Callahan as a member, really? What do you think, Matt?
I guess it does kind of strain my impression of what I thought Kata was supposed to mean if we're saying that Callahan is a member, was a full member of their family, right? Because it's supposed to mean family, and it's I mean, sorry Donnie, but even at the end of this book we get the notion that maybe they'll find maybe Jake, Susanna, and Eddie will find a weird looking dog to be their friend, but I don't remember there being a mention that they'll be going to mass and there'll be Father Callahan there or something. So like he just seems much less important to their journey. I mean, he seems a bit more important than like Brodigan, but not that much more important. So. Yeah,
I mean, I think this is a really, really good question because it is always something that I've wondered about. We have this kame term, for people that are put in their path to help them out, but not considered a member of the quartet. Like John Cullen is not a member of the quartet specifically, right? He's just a tool that Ka has put in their path to help them. And it is interesting that Callahan is granted this. Now, granted, Callahan is with them for 2 entire books, so perhaps that's why. But he does feel external to them in a lot of ways. Like he is part of the family in many ways, but he is external of the family in many ways as well. I seriously wonder if this is just an earlier version of what King thought that he was going to do, and he kind of changed his mind about it with later characters. I mean, it could to me just reflect how much love King has for Callahan as a character. Like, one of his earliest characters, his second book he ever wrote, and a character they just kind of left hanging, and he really wanted to give them the ending they deserved, and so he made them really important in the story. He added them to be part of this family. But I love him as a character. He's great, and he gets his whole arc, he gets his redemption, he gets his moment. But yeah, calling him a member of the quartet just seemed a little weird.
Yeah, I don't remember if I made this joke on the show or not, but I've wondered if member of the quartet doesn't just mean main character of the series. And
Sure.
And since you're right, like even though he was only with them for like 2 days or whatever, it was still 2 whole books worth of story time, and thus that qualifies him.
Yeah. It could be as simple as that. Yeah. Cool.
All right.
Good question, though.
Yeah, that was fun. All right. Next from 77 Pixies 96. They say, if you could pick any character from Stephen King's other work for Roland to pull into his world on the next iteration, who would it be and why?
Alan fucking Pangborn.
You stolen one of the characters from the only other book that I read.
Well, he's in many books, Matt, and he's great in all of them.
I'm gonna just be very cheap and just say Carrie White.
Interesting.
Because number one, she has telekinetic pyrokinesis and so forth. That would be pretty useful. Mm-hmm. And then also, like, wouldn't that be nice? Like, Carrie White gets saved from her shitty life and doesn't have to die horribly. Sorry, spoilers.
Yeah. So he draws her like prom night morning.
Yeah. Like, and then she's like, maybe she's really mad because she didn't get to go to prom, not realizing that it would have been really bad. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Let's see, who else? Jack Sawyer, that would be great. That's kind of obvious though from the Talisman. Beverly Marsh from It would be fun. Any characters from It. Let's do Ben from It. That's great. Love him. Love Ben Hanscom. Or Stuttering Bill. He's kind of already a robot, but whatever. Any of them, but also none of them, because like it's not a fun. Yeah, it's not a fun ride. This being drawn into Midworld.
Yeah, it's purgatory.
Yeah. Next, we have Wilbot858, who says, one point I had hoped was covered was the watch that was given to Roland by Moses Carver. The people who watched and read all of Stephen King and the Tet Corporation knew it at some points would or could start to run backwards. To me, this would mean that either A, know that he is on an ever-looping quest, and even their work is meaningless, or B, have some inkling that as the hands wind back as he nears the tower, it means something for Roland's time alone. Essentially, the hands are winding back to the beginning as he nears the tower. It's an omen of things to come. In any case, it's very interesting, and I wish there was more conversation about the watch. Yeah, the watch is really interesting because I think it's this thing that's introduced in the story. It has this very specific meaning, and I think it's really interesting that one of the things King makes sure to do is show that Patrick picks up the watch before he leaves, and that it eventually returns to normal as he walks away from the tower, and that's kind of the last thing we get to see. So, I mean, I think you're right, Will, that the watch is specifically meant to explore this idea that as you get closer to the tower, you get closer to the beginning, and that's why time is running backwards. I don't know. The reason I didn't talk about it so much is I don't know what it can mean beyond that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that like literally they were literally going back in time as they were getting closer to the tower, which is not something I was thinking about at the time. Like if they had turned around and gone back, would they have found, Dandelo still there?
I don't know if they're literally going back in time.
But it's interesting because I mean, obviously Roland does go back in time. So, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I just think that Stephen King thought it would be cool if the watch went backwards as he went closer to the tower.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I love about introducing the watch is that the final lesson that the tower. I love that the concept of time is kind of brought to the forefront at the end of this book, not only in the fact that we go back in time, but Roland is specifically told your problem has always been time. It would have been a matter of 3 seconds to stop and pick up the thing, but you didn't have the time. Time has always been your thing, Roland. And so we have this watch. And I think one of the things The Watch does is show something that we've always known about this world, that time is soft and that time never lines up the way we think it's going to. It never works the way it normally does. And so for Roland to have this obsession with time is running out and we don't have enough time, it's nonsense. And it's not as time is not as important as you think it is, because time moves the way the story wants it to, not the way it normally runs.
Yeah.
And that goes back to this whole random thing we had where Roland was really good at knowing how long a minute was and then lost that skill at some point, because time is so nebulous in this world, and to make your decisions based off of what you have time to do and what you don't have time to do is kind of absurd.
Yeah. I like that. I like the idea that yes, absolutely. Right. Now that you've laid that out, that makes perfect sense. That the tower's lesson to him was like, time is not as important as you think it is. And these people, they gave him a watch, and then the tower uses the watch to show him that he had plenty of time all along. Right? Mm-hmm. That's cool. I like that. All right. Next, Dark Gazing says, I tend to agree with you guys. The end of the cycle will be when Roland finally develops enough to cry off the tower when the day is won at Algo Ciento and live out his days with his friends, maybe even reestablishing the new line of Eld through Jake. But between saving the beam and saving Fred King, we lose Jake and Eddie. So maybe allow your fan fiction flags to fly a little. Is there a golden Kala ending for our whole quartet where they don't die, maybe on Revolution 99? This is assuming Roland is still drawing the same quartet, I guess. Maybe this time around, Roland has remembered the bulletproof helmet of Eld that Eddie happened to borrow in Blue Haven, and all of them going together to save Fred King changes things. Yeah, I mean, I think in this conversation so far, we've sketched out a number of different possibilities for subsequent loops.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we said, one choice at the beginning of the loop could change everything so fundamentally that, yeah, I certainly believe that there is a way for all of our characters to get through this thing without getting shot in the head or thrown in front of a van.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like in my little fan fiction headcanon, they do all live the next time. I don't think, I think on the loop where they win, I don't think any quartet members die. Yeah. That's my fan fiction anyway.
Sure. But I mean, I don't know, maybe not, because like, I think it is important to understand that even if you do everything right, sometimes people still die. That's the nature of life.
That's true. Yeah.
I don't know. I want that for our characters, certainly, but that's not how things work all the time. So
there's that tension with Ka, right? Where if you write the maximally happy story, then it might just be a bad story that you wrote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. So Ekatin has written us something really long here. I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. Listening to the latest episode, and I was struck by a thought during the intervention section. You guys compare Deep Now to the caring friend or family, and Eddie to the addict that can relate. Or that has been there before. This is to the intervention scene with Calvin Tower. And then compared Roland to the doctor or therapist that would come in at the end with some sort of professional opinion or diagnosis. You also said how this sort of doesn't make sense since Roland is dealing with his own addiction. That made me think of Roland's journey as a whole, how he is doomed to repeat this whole process once he reaches the tower. We know that King is Roland and Roland is King. When they save King's life, Roland's hip pain goes away. We know that when King began the Gunslinger, he was drinking and doing drugs. In 1987, when Drawing of the Three was published, his family had an intervention for him, so he was not sober for the writing of Drawing of the Three, but he has been sober since then. Could King's idea of addiction be changed as he wrote the rest of the series? Given his sobriety, I don't like to think of the repeating nature of the series being linked directly to that. He has not begun that addiction again. I have started to think, maybe, King replaced his unhealthy addiction for another, writing. As Roland's journey begins each time it ends, so does King's. He finishes one story only to begin another. This world, this multiverse, continues and lives on. The tower still stands. With King making himself a godlike character, or at least a channel for Gan to speak, it makes his work comparable to Roland's. It's all done for the tower. To circle back, is this addiction okay? It's all done to save existence as a whole. Does that make it okay? I don't know. And they're just kind of wondering how we feel about this. Matt, you want to take a stab at this? This is a big ideas here.
Yeah. It's. I mean, I think that Ekatin kind of walked through a lot of logical thoughts in their writing here. Anyway, I mean, I love the idea that the Stephen King who started the Dark Tower series and wrote the first 3 books might have had a very different idea about what it would mean to reach the tower. Because he was in the throes of a number of self-destructive addictions, and it's unclear the degree to which he understood that Roland's pursuit of the tower was a metaphor for pursuing your unhealthy addictions.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite Stephen King quote of all time is him writing the entirety of The Shining about a self-destructing addict writer and not realizing that he was writing about himself until after he realized that he was an alcoholic and a drug addict. It's wild how the mind works. So you can channel all that into a character like Jack Torrance and not even realize that you have the same problem you're putting into your character.
Right. Or you know,
at least not consciously, rather. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, sort of Eddie Dean, same thing in Drawing of the Three, right? Yeah. So I love the idea that like the Stephen King that finishes the Dark Tower with a happy ending can't be the Stephen King who started the Dark Tower doing coke. Of course, he's not going to write another Dark Tower, so we just have to imagine what that looks like.
Yeah, but I mean, I think to their point, like he's made a shared universe for his stories, so every single one of his stories is for the tower, which represents the Stephen King universe. So does making this cyclical say that addiction is in its nature cyclical and you're always going to fall back on your own addiction? I think no, because I do think addiction is cyclical in some ways, right? Like it's hard and it's a constant thing that you struggle with constantly.
Yeah.
And you're never going to be freed from it totally, but you know that when those choices rear their ugly head, when like, do you want to drink that beer? Do you want to take that hit? You know that you can and have the strength and ability to make the right choices.
Yeah.
So I think it comes back to choice. So no, I don't. First of all, yes, it's undoubtedly true that King changed as a person so much between the first 3 books, or the first 4 books even, and the last 3. His near-death experience obviously completely morphed what the series was going to be about, and it began as a series maybe dealing with the tower as an addiction metaphor, and then moved into it really dealing with the idea of mortality and the idea of dying and what that means for him and for his story and for all these things. But I don't think we have to look at this addiction thing and say that, oh, so everything looping just means you're going to be addicted forever. No.
Yeah.
No.
Well, so I think about the fact that from the way King talks about it, I think he's of the belief that like if you're an alcoholic, then you're an alcoholic. You don't kick it and then you're not an alcoholic anymore. And that thought led me to consider like the hypothetical, 23rd loop or whatever, where Roland or maybe the 20th loop. Sure, we'll say the 20th loop. Whatever loop it is where Roland successfully cries off. Okay, so what does that actually look like? Like let's walk through that day. Roland has decided that living with his family and caring for his son is more important to him than going to the tower, because he just knows that he'll lose everything if he goes to the tower. Okay, wakes up the next morning. Tower's still there. He still feels the call of it. He still knows that this burning question, this secret that has been driving him for his whole life and for several lifetimes actually, is still there. Still, he could this morning he could change his mind and he say, you know what, Jake, it's harder than I thought. It's something. It reminds me of something King said about writing, where he's like, the days that he takes off writing are the hard work because he wants to be writing. It's like it would be hard for Roland to not go to the tower. Like that's a whole different character arc, right? Like you can have the arc of Roland decides not to go to the tower, and then you have the arc of Roland gets actually good at dealing with his addiction and works it into his life where he still does feel that pull, but he doesn't succumb to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that King struggled with is this idea that your addiction is inherently tied to your creation.
Mm-hmm.
Like this idea that it's the old Hemingway struggling artist thing, right? Where you drink because it's what makes you a good writer. And I think he's talked about this on Writing, so I'm not even speculating here, that like the idea that if I quit that thing, I lose the thing that has defined my life, which is his writing, his creation. I won't be able to create again. And I think that metaphor lines up with Roland very much, because he is a tower junkie, but he has devoted his entire life to this quest. This is the entire meaning of his life, is getting to this tower. And so what does it mean to say, actually, I'm good.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that King was struggling with at this time was this idea of retiring from writing. When he got hurt, he was struggling writing. His first book after he wrote was a book called Dreamcatcher, which is not a very good book. He was struggling with writing. And I think part of him in his mind, I think, was like, I'm going to finish these stories and then I'm just not going to be a writer anymore. And so I think a lot of this is struggling with the idea of, what does my life look like if I don't have this in it? What does my life look like if I don't have the tower in it? What does my life look like if I don't have writing in it? What does that mean? And who am I if I'm not Roland chasing for the tower?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, part of what any addiction becomes, because for the people that are truly addicted, it has become their life. It's become their life.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to see a version of your life away from that. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what that day looks like for Roland.
Yeah.
But it's going to be really fucking hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next from Steve D. Why didn't Patrick get a shout out from Roland as he entered the tower? Sure, he wasn't part of the quartet, but he was a key player in the last part of the story. Hell, even the traitor Hacks the Cook got a roll call. Poor Patrick didn't even get a proper say thank you. Can we get an amen for Patrick? Dare I say a god bomb? I know we haven't gotten there yet, but is it possible the Wind in the Keyhole took place on another version of Roland's unending journey?
So those are two different questions,
okay.
I think.
Two different questions, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick kind of gets the short shrift everywhere, right?
Just kind of wanders out of this story. And I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if like Patrick showed up in some other Stephen King story at some point. Like, that just seems like the kind of fun, cute thing that he would do.
But why didn't he get a shout out? Because he was just not there long enough? I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I guess I just figured he was right there. He didn't need to have his name called because he made it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it seems to be mostly people that have either died or been lost on his quest.
Yeah.
And he's just there.
Yeah. That would be my guess.
I mean, the reason he hacks the cook is a death that he feels responsible for, because he's the one that told on him. So that's why he shouts out Hax's name, because he ended Hax's life by choosing to reveal his treachery. And it's him it's one of the first instances in which he deals with the actions of his choices. Oh, if I do something, if I say something, people die.
Yeah.
It's like it's an important moment for a child to learn that their choices have real, permanent, immediate consequences.
Yeah, it does make me reflect on that moment, because obviously Roland has killed a ton of people, but that was the one where it taught him a lesson, and so that's what makes it significant to him.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
All right, and as for your second question, Steve, I think we can circle around to Wind Through the Keyhole when we finish that book.
All right, Nat says, the warnings about Dandelo have always have been bugging me. What was the purpose in secrecy in Eddie saying to Jake, watch out for Dandelo, Jake passing that on to Oy, and finally it reaching Roland through Oy's mind? Like Chinese whispers, it risks getting jumbled, and I didn't see the need for the secrecy after all that.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for this, other than this is kind of some of the clunkiness of King throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks here in the final book. I agree with you. This is a part that just didn't feel necessary to me. It didn't feel necessary to kind of hide this thing and do this long daisy chain of information passing about this one moment. It's not necessary.
Well, also it failed is maybe one thing to point out. Like
yeah,
the warning failed. The only reason that they survived is because Stephen King saved them. So that says to me what exactly? I guess it could be something along the lines that they really did need Eddie to make it, to come along with them, to get a, to get a trip to the tower with no required mulligans of Stephen King stepping in. You actually do need to keep all your quartet members alive, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. I think it works. It works on the reader level because it raises tension for us, but for the characters themselves, it's not. There's no reason for it.
But I wonder if this was like a post hoc, second draft thing where he was like, "How do I foreshadow Dandolo?" Which I thought of on page 9,000. And then he works in, okay, well, we're going to change Eddie's last words to be a warning about Dandolo.
But then, like, yeah, you can almost see this as a lot of times, like when you're in the construction of a story, sometimes you just get to points where you're like, okay, I need person X to know why. How do I get them that information? And it becomes actually really challenging because, like, to move your pieces around, it just messes things up so much.
Yeah.
That sometimes you just have to do something like this, where, like, if the thing is, like, I need Susanna to know the warning about Dandolo because I need her to be in the bathroom and then remember it and be like, oh shit, this is it, this is him. How do I get Susanna this information? Well, I don't know. Come from Eddie, but how does it get from Eddie to her? Well, she, like, and then you wonder, like, why he felt the need to go through this chain of characters, and it's almost as if they're like each passing it on before they go. But I don't know. It's a little clunky. I agree.
Yeah, I guess it was interesting to watch them, like, not understand the purpose of this thing, even until it was, beyond the point when it was too late, basically. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Yeah. All right. Christopher W. says, a plot device I have noticed in a bunch of Stephen King novels is characters forgetting major plot events, particularly ones we might assume are otherwise unforgettable. Examples include when the losers fight their battle with Pennywise, when Ralph forgets about the events of Insomnia, when Jack forgets about his adventures in the Territories, and when Susanna begins to lose her memories of Midworld after she passes through the door at the end of the Dark Tower, also including Roland himself forgetting his journey through the Dark Tower. What function does this device serve, and why does King keep revisiting this motif? That's a really good question. I think this motif is used generally as a capper on an adventure. I think there are, first of all, our memories fade of everything, right? Like, not in this literal way, but when you close a book, you remember the big moments, you kind of forget everything in between. And that strikes me as exactly how Susanna's memory of this whole thing is going to fade. She is going to remember, she's going to remember that she's done all this before. She's going to remember that she knows these people from this other place, but the details of that quest are going to fade from her in time. And I think that's from a storytelling perspective, from a meta perspective in the Dark Tower, I think that's absolutely what it serves. It's that, like, we close a book, we put it aside, and we remember it, but we don't, if you're just reading it normally, like a normal person and not like Matt and I, you're not going to remember a lot of the detail in 5 years and 10 years. You're just going to remember the big moments, the things that really affected you.
Yeah, I like that. I like that you took it to the meta level. I kind of automatically took it to the immediate level of just, like, if you don't do that in many cases, then you have sort of ruined that character's life, and you may not want to be ending your story that way.
Sure.
Like, I haven't read, hardly any of those books that you listed, but, like, I vaguely know what happens in it. So, like, if if you live the entire rest of your life knowing that there's an interdimensional monster that eats children that you defeated, but there may be other things like it out there, that's sort of going to dominate your thinking for the rest of your days. And like what are you just going to go become a accountant or whatever, like knowing that that's true?
Fair.
And so if you want to be able to give your characters a happily ever after ish ending, there are circumstances where you might have to just be like, and then they kind of just forgot all the stuff that that happened, because otherwise it would really derail things and we couldn't have a happy ending here.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think King does it for specific reasons. In each one of those things that you've listed, I think there's a specific thematic reason for it. I think he likes it as a motif because for many of the reasons I said and Matt said, but like in it, there's a very specific reason thematically why they forget their battle with Pennywise. And maybe we'll talk about that one day when we read that book. But I do think it's a motif that he likes because I think losing memory is such a powerful thing to do to a character. But I think he always makes it make thematic sense when he employs it. And I think in The Dark Tower, it's mostly the most thematic sense it makes is on a kind of meta level.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Last question from Colin G. They say, my question is, how far have you gone down the theory crafting rabbit hole since last week, Matt? Have you started the series over again yet? I mean, I think today we talked about most of my theory crafting rabbit holing, which I'll probably go way deeper given time. But definitely definitely been thinking about, but then again, part of me is like, well, what do you mean exactly by theory crafting? Because what I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of doing permutations on like what could happen next. But but the phrase theory crafting makes you wonder if there's not some like deeper lore where Stephen King fans have put together things that I haven't even thought of yet.
Yes, there definitely exists. Yeah.
Makes sense. There always is, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Have I started the series over yet? I did start the series over. I read through him meeting Brown, and what was funny is I found all of these cool things that I obviously didn't notice. Like, for example, he teaches Brown is trying to teach his raven Zoltan the Lord's Prayer. So that's another mirroring where Susanna says the Lord's Prayer at the end of the book. Zoltan starts to say the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of the book, the beginning of the series. That was just a cool mirroring that I never would have noticed otherwise. And then what happened is I stopped because I decided that I wanted to read on writing again, because it seemed relevant. And so I stopped reading and I started reading that instead.
I love how you don't tell me when you do these things, but you just start sending me messages. Like I forget what you just sent me a message, and I was sitting next to my wife, and I turned to her. Matt's reading on writing again.
I'm sending you little puzzles to brighten your day, Scott.
I love it. I'm not complaining. Not complaining at all. It's just you don't say, "Hey Scott, I'm reading on writing. Here's what I think." It's just this random thought that popped into your head, and I was like, because I've read that book so many times, I'm like, "Oh, he's reading on writing again."
And I knew you would get it. That's why I didn't preface it at all.
It's great. It's great. All right. That's it this week. If you asked a question and we did not answer it this time around, it's because we've put it in our overall series discussion questions. So we are going to read a few more mailbag questions next week. There's not too many, but a few more next week as we prepare to wrap up the series as a whole. So look forward to hearing your questions discussed next week. Thank you for those that sent those in. And as we said, there's still time to send in some more questions. If you have some overall mailbag series questions that you didn't get in before the cutoff this time, there's still time. So send those in. We love answering them, as we just did it for like an hour. So that's it. That's it for us this week. Next week, we will be joined by a very special guest to take one final look back at the entire 7-episode series before we move on to the Wind Through the Keyhole.
All right. Can't wait for that. Remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, the subreddit r/doof media is a cool place to hang out. No real question this week, but you can still post more, mailbag questions to there if you want.
Or more just thoughts about the ending or the series or anything. We'd love to read them. Even if we don't read them out loud here, we are reading everything you guys send us. So please keep them coming.
Absolutely.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, now's the time to do it as we prepare to move into season 2. So you'll never miss an episode of that. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else in the world you can listen to podcasts.
Yeah. If you like any of our shows and you want to support them, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. We really need those donations so that we can decide to keep reading Stephen King books. As for now, though, special thanks to new patrons Jill K and Doug G, both at the $5 level. I hope you enjoy the stuff we have at that tier, and welcome to the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you cannot, I can't believe you just threatened them. I will never read another page of Stephen King unless you give me money now.
Yeah. We need to have blackmail tiers instead of reward tiers.
There we go. If you cannot afford to donate to us right now, that is absolutely okay. You can instead help us out by sharing this podcast with all your Stephen King loving friends or just randomly on all those social medias. Also, you can help us out by leaving a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, or if podcast reviewing is available on any other platforms, there too. This week's Spotlight review comes from Jen D, who gives us 5 stars and says, "Serving the beam. I have joined Roland and the quartet on their journey several times, but I've never enjoyed it as much as I am with you guys on board. I am loving taking the trip through the eyes of the seasoned reader alongside a beam novice. It's so fun to think back on my first read and remember how crazy, bizarre, and unpredictable of a trip it really was. I binged your podcast daily for a month until I caught up, and now the wait each week is torture. Keep up the great work, and I hope you keep it going after the series. I request The Stand, It, and 11/22/63. My top 3. Well, thank you so much, Jen. And I can say with absolute certainty that at least one of those stories will be in our season 2 lineup. The rest of which we will be fully revealing. I think we're going to do it next week, Matt. I think I'll say what all the books are next week. No word on when that's actually going to start, because we still have a whole book left to do of this thing. But just to give people a little taste.
I'm excited. I mean, all 3 of those are ones that I would just want to read regardless of podcasts. So, yeah.
All right, folks, that is finally it for us this week. We'll see you right back here next week to look back at the entire 7-book series before heading out on our quest once again to go through like a keyhole or something. I don't know. It's all weird. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.